able to connect. Yes, good evening, everyone. Hi, Gennia Nuh. I'm the project lead for the Story Project 11 by www.tellmeyourstory.biz. And I welcome you to the fourth session of the Letters from Santa series. The project Letters from Santa is addressed to parents and children. Though Santa is a mythical creation, most of us are blessed with the participation of our parents, especially the mothers in our life who look after us, take care of us, fulfill our wishes, and guide us to the right path. The project aims at providing insightful guidance and evoke interest in certain aspects of life that may shape the life of children better. Today, I'm privileged to have with us Deyasini Roy, Sukriti Paul Kumar, and Somrita Urni Ganguly this evening. And we are going to discuss how to explain gender equality to children by making use of poetry. Let me begin with introducing the panelists. Deyashini Roy is an award winning young poet and editor. She has completed her post graduation in English and comparative literature from Pondicherry University. Poetry occupies a conspicuous part of her life, and therefore she would certainly spare no pains in seeing her tender thoughts sprout. She is an incorrigible dreamer, an itinerant rain seeker who loves to set recourse to the idyllic and pastoral and record her impressionably sensitive response to the lilting cadence of nature, rendered in a swirl of lurid slashes and subtle brushstrokes. Sukrita Paul Kumar is a noted poet and critic. She held the Aruna Asaf Ali Chair at the University of Delhi till recently. She is a fellow at the prestigious International Writing Program IWA. She was the former fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla. She has published several collections of poetry, translations, and critical books. She is the recipient of many residencies and fellowships, also held exhibitions of her paintings. Somrita Urni Ganguly is a professor, award winning poet, and literary translator. She was a Fulbright doctoral research fellow at Brown University. She is also an alumna of the University of East Anglia's International Literary Translation and Creative Writing Summer School. She served as a judge for the PEN America Translation Prize and the Kamla Das Poetry Awards. She is the expert reader for the English PEN Translation Grant, the National Endowment for the Arts Translation Grant offered by the US federal government, and the National Translation Award. She works as the head of the Department of English in Maharaja Manindra Chandra College, affiliated to the University of Calcutta. She has worked on poetry and literary translation projects with national and international forums. So, welcome you all to this session. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I would begin by delving into the first question of the session, and this is a very common question addressed to every one of you. Please share some insights about the poetry that you have grown listening up and your experience of listening to those. I would begin with Shukrita, ma'am, please.
Sure. Well, it's very difficult to say where one started with, what one started with, but well, the impressions that particularly during adolescence, and I think many of us would probably agree, particularly when you're doing American literature and British and so on. So one of the poets that immediately comes to mind is Sylvia Plath, and the whole notion of confessional poetry. And that was something that came in a very big way. And soon after, actually, Kamla Das was also a contemporary of Sylvia Plath. So Kamla Das from our own country and our own kind of setup here, and Sylvia Plath from the American context, well, not so much as American, but as a woman, who was basically, whether it would be Britain or America or wherever, it was a very candid kind of poetic expression that she gave to in a confessional kind of a mode, and brought in subjects which otherwise were not at all referred to, whether it was reproduction, childbirth, or it was, I mean, I can't forget that last line of the poem, Daddy, isn't it? Daddy, you bastard. And, my goodness. I mean, that kind of courage of conviction and the approach that she had to gender, obviously, and very experiential. So there was a personal note which reached out to many of us as our note, our personal notes. So that was one in a very big way. And then also something immediately that clicked my mind was Kamla Das, and Kamla Das also doing similar stuff, and very bold and very kind of candid about being a woman, and the whole idea of rebellious nature, just defiance, a spirit of defiance, that in the 70s particularly. I mean, most of you are very young, but I am of the generation where 70s played a very big role. So 70s was like Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, Kamla Das, Famida Riaz, Kishwar Nahid, women poets. It just took over my imagination and my pen in a way, and directed me to get into the domain of understanding what being a woman is, right? And what are the experiences. So that's one. And also the other set was like, if you're looking at male, and Ghalib to me was very important. Faiz to me was very important, but they were not dealing with gender so much. And there was a kind of taken for granted situation out there, though I loved their poetry. But there wasn't that, there was defiance, but it was anti establishment poetry. And in that sense, it was anti patriarchal, I would say. Mhm. Do you want me to go on, or do we go to the next one?
Sorry, I was muted. I was actually waiting for you to go on. I loved listening to you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Now, moving on to Somrita ma'am, if you would give me your insight as to what poetry you have grown up listening to, and what did you experience listening it as a child?
Am I audible, Genia? Okay. Thank you. Before I begin, thank you so much, Genia, for that very warm introduction. Welcome to everybody that's joined us on our live stream on Facebook or who might watch a recording of this session later. I'm eminently honored to be here with Sukrita, with Deyasini. Um, Interestingly, they are both poets that I've read and poets that I've talked to but never met in person. So I'm very thankful to Coral and TMYS for sort of creating this platform for us to get together. Two female poets, if I might say so, whose works I've been reading of late, and absolutely in awe of some of the work that Sukriti has been doing for several years now, and Deyasini is now somebody, she's a force to reckon with. Sukriti has already mentioned some of my influences. But I'll go a little back and talk about who I grew up reading and listening to. And I'll start with listening to because I come from a family that is very musically oriented. And when I would wake up every morning, we would have music playing. And obviously, this is a Bengali household, so Rabindra Sangit, Nochul Giti. But what stood out for me, despite being a Bengali, and it's okay, people take offense, but that's all right. More than Rabindra Sangit, what stood out for me was the music of Lalon Pokir. And it is through this baul music that I sort of entered into this terrain of bhakti poetry and Sufi music. And something that struck me immediately about the works of Mirabai, of course, but also Kabir Das and Tulsi Das was how they were able to completely swallow their gendered identity, as it were, and how they were able to recreate themselves or reimagine themselves as women very often. Um, and they expressed their love for this male god figure. And this was not just spiritual love, unlike what we think of bhakti poetry. There was a lot of intimacy, there was a lot of intensity, a lot of passion, so deeply passionate physical love as well. And that was something. So, in a way, you could say um, that my imagination, which was fertile at that age, was already getting enriched by how we can think of the body, how we can think of the soul, and how we can think of union of bodies and the presence of bodies on paper or in music. Obviously, then in a more formal way for me, it's funny, really. It's funny because now I discuss British literature with students, graduate students, undergraduate students. So now it's funny, but back then it was a shock to me. The only female poet in my syllabus was Kamala Das. For the longest time, there was nobody else. And the first work that we read by her was an introduction. And Sukriti has talked about confessional poetry, and that was my introduction to confessional poetry. Then I, studied a little bit, um, and I discovered Sylvia Plath and later Anne Sexton. Obviously, Eunice D'Souza as well, another Indian English poet. And I love these women able to for today, right? Because until Silat explodes on the scene. It was about drugs, it was about alcohol, it was about sex, it was about road trips, it was about a brotherhood. And there was no woman allowed into this sort of very male territory. And then Sylvia Plath comes in and says, no, women write confessional poetry as well. You either never imagined women as consumers of sex and drugs and alcohol and road trips, or you just never imagined women as people with the ability to write. What is interesting to me now is that this phrase, confessional poetry, is almost seen as an insult. I've heard this so often, especially in the Indian English literary circle, where there have been male editors, male publishers who will come up and say, oh, but these female poets, they are, they only write confessional poetry. हाँ, but मैं क्या लिखूं? Right? मैं किस चीज के बारे में लिखूं? I can talk about nature. Yes, I can talk about the birds, sure. But so do you. Who's going to talk about my lived experience? Who's going to talk about my gendered experience? Who's going to talk about my confessions? Because, if you actually think about it, men write very badly about women. We have, historically and traditionally been reduced to our curves and our cunt, and, these crazy descriptions of women's breasts, the metaphors that they've used, breasts that look like teardrops, breasts that defy gravity and look like drops of water hanging in space. It's ridiculous, right? So if men are going to write that badly about women, who's going to write about our experiences, our gendered, lived everyday reality? Women, we ourselves. So it's very interesting that Shukrita, we talked about confessional poetry, and that's when I got thinking about how today this is seen almost as an insult, almost as something that women should be ashamed to do, ashamed to claim this space for themselves, ashamed to sort of explode as a meteor into this constellation of male stars. So, yeah, these are my influences. Currently, I'm reading a lot of Orson Shire. I'm reading friends like Nur Duran Duman. She's a Turkish poet. They're in a bad state currently in Turkey, in Syria. Um, Eleni Sikelianos, she's a Greek poet based in America at this point in time. Tiffany Atkinson. Women are writing, we ought to listen to them. That's all I can say for now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, coming to Deyasini, ma'am. Ma'am, if you would tell me how you grew up listening to the poetry as a
Yeah.
child.
Thank you so much, Gennia, for having me here and for that lovely introduction. And to begin with, poetry occupied a very significant part of my childhood. I have grown up listening to Upendra Kishore, Roy Chaudhary, Shukumar Ray, Rabindranath Tagore, Jotindra Mohan Bakshi, Kazi Nazrul Islam, Satyendranath Dotto, and many more. But most importantly, I don't remember reading them by myself. They were mostly read out to me by my grandmother. So, poetry for me was an enchanter, and her voice added so much to it. So, poetry was not always for me a dispenser of sleep, but an unfailing source of many awakenings and reawakenings later. Therefore, when I grew up, the best poetry always revolved around my grandmother and my memories with her, be it in the makeshift fireplace in our old home or in the beetle leaf induced fragrance that she would often emit, and her customary drying off the aromatic lemon achar on our sun speckled terrace. And of course, her terrace garden so lovingly tended. So, as a woman, much ahead of her time, she introduced me to the immanent beauty around and made me appreciate them. So, poetry for me is a prismatic jar where I preserve all the totems of life in all their flavors and fancies, and these sharp, delectable flavors of childhood formed over many teacups and eclectic conversations become an overwhelming presence in my poems later on. And in one of them, I would write, uh, did you know the cupboard that day woke up in a jolt of vibrant turquoise, in his earthen brown coat after morning coffee, and played the old chorus of our grandmom's running fingers, trickles of Nolingur in sunset ginger. Those were our seasons running, summers, rains, and winters, in poems of achar, namkeen, and narrows. When I grew up, I realized that poetry, like my grandmother, anchored me towards all things beautiful, something that I would observe in the bylanes that turn by so quickly, in the undulating crowd of the people, within the affectionate walls of my room, or in my lampshade beside. So it was always the maintainer of my sanity. It has always been the pilgrimage, an unbelievable succor, bringing to me oftentimes the deepest moments of revelation. I would like to stop here.
Well, it was pure synesthetic effect on me. Thank you so much. Now, coming to the second question of the session, how would you define gender? And if you could tell us about the poems that made you think of the gendered society while you were young. Somrita ma'am, would you take your time?
Thank you, Gennia. I have a feeling I'll be repeating myself if I try and answer the second part of your question because that's sort of what we've been discussing. But let's come to the elephant in the room. You must stop me at some point because this is something that I can continue talking about forever. Not only because this is a part of my PhD work, but as a woman in India, as a young woman in the Indian English Poetry Circle, I'm angry and I have a lot to talk about. But gender. Um, we need to start at the very basics, right? Especially because I'm hoping that at some point there'll be children watching a recording of this session, and they will be seeing this as a starting point or as an introduction to something that we don't really talk about. In our households, middle class households, in schools, there is very little consciousness about gender. And when Coral said, and then you wrote to me and you said, this is a session on talking to children about gender, the first thought that struck me is that it's really easy to talk to children about gender because they don't have preconceived notions. The problem comes with adults. The problem comes with, if you look at something as basic as a gender reveal party, that is so common in Western cultures, not common here for completely different and violent reasons. Um, what is a gender reveal party? Even before the child is out of your womb, you've assigned a color to it. You don't even know what sex the child is going to be born with. This is not something that we can be sure of anymore, as science has proven, because there are intersex children that are assigned genders at birth by parents in consultation with their doctors, right? Um, there are adults determining for children that their toys will have a gender, that girls will grow up with dolls and boys will grow up with airplanes. And I remember when I was growing up, my gifts from other people would always be Barbie dolls. And I hated playing with them because they didn't look like me and I couldn't identify with them. And they were, honestly, Barbie dolls are not very attractive to little children because they're really hard and they're plastic and they break. So a child wants to play with things that are more enduring, warm, soft. My airplanes and my cars would come from my mom and dad. Um, our parents decided that colors have gender, that reds and pinks and oranges are for the women, and the blues and the browns and the blacks are for the men. Society decided that emotions come with a gender. मर्द को दर्द नहीं होता तो मर्द रो नहीं सकते हैं. And if you cry too much, you're a crybaby. So it's really not so difficult to talk to children about gender because they are not creating this binary. The binary has been created by adults. So, going back to the basics, what is gender? It is a social construct. A construct, it's something that we created. There is nothing about our body or about our sex that tells us or that warrants that we need to behave in a particular way, we need to love in a particular way, we need to eat and talk and walk and sleep in a particular way. These are things that are imposed on children from the moment they are born. I don't know if we can do it here. I'll probably not go into the complication of it, but if I could present my screen, I can probably share it with you later. But I saw this brilliant cartoon, the Nancy series, where in the first square we see Nancy coming down the stairs, except that she's not coming down in a very ladylike way. She's sliding down the railing, and she's got her feet on both sides, her legs on both sides. It's as if she's riding the railing and she comes sliding down. So her mother tells her, Nancy, go right back up and come down as a lady. So what does Nancy do? She goes back up, she sits on the railing, she crosses her leg, and she slides down again, right? It's not difficult to talk to children about gender. In fact, what we should do, especially as the newer generation of children take the center stage, is to tell them that these are binaries that societies, that governments, that politicians, that parents, in all such institutions, religions, school, etc., have created to make life easy for themselves, and that children shouldn't fall for that trap. They are just learning about pronouns. It's not very difficult to teach a child the third pronoun, which is they. It's difficult for adults to accept it because suddenly they start thinking about grammar. And I wonder, Have you never made grammatical errors in your life that you're suddenly so stuck up on? Oh, but they doesn't fit in a sentence. How can I say they is coming for a person that wants to be identified as they, as the non binary pronoun? Right? So, that is my understanding of gender. It is fluid. It creates a society that is free for all. It is something that we need to talk about as much as we can because it is about our basic right to identity. And of course, gender is constructed, just as sex is constructed. Again, something that people find very difficult to believe, but sex is constructed. Sex can be constructed. We are living in the post truth era. We are living in the times of the cyborg. We are living in times when you can inject anything in your body to look any way that you want to. And it's just really sad that people are still stuck up on the centuries old binary of man and woman, male and female, which is the sexual identity. Right. So, yeah, if I were to talk to a child, that's what I would tell a child. Your sexuality can be determined at a later stage. It can be different from what society has told you you need to identify with. Your sex can be determined at a which too can be different. Also, your gender, which is the easiest and most important, if that's what you want to identify with. Right? So,
Thank you so much, ma'am. I would like to move on with the same question with Shukrita, ma'am.
Yeah.
I'm not sure
So
if I'm.
I think a lot has been said by Somrita, and I'm really appreciative of what she's saying because, and though this is kind of, for us who are doing literature, who are doing gender, who are sort of in gender studies, we are quite involved academically as well. We are familiar with these concepts. We know how, binaries, the conditioning happens and all that. And yet it goes on in society, the way it is practiced is so abominable, absolutely abominable. And one doesn't know how to deconstruct that, rather demolish it, totally demolish the binary the way it functions. Now, I think it's one thing that we have to make clear to, and I would refer to, the bhakti movement for that matter, Sufi and bhakti. And I think that's very pertinent out here, where the he and she totally reverses, right? And the he is identifying himself as she. And so basically the point I think that we need to constantly make is, how does one genuinely perceive or identify one's own self and give space for that? And I think if the child is given that space, first of all, you as the mother or the father need to do it, right? Because many of the mothers and the fathers are themselves not aware of what they are doing because they have fitted themselves into the binary. It's not as if they have given themselves time to think, reflect. And that's where poetry comes in a very big way. For instance, I was looking at the book, Kishwar Nahid's book called in translation, which is called We Sinful Women. And the women who are branded as sinful because they think differently, right? And therefore, those voices need to be heard in poetry, because then poetry makes you sensitized to this entire idea of transcending, not even transcending, it's just authentic self-perception. Authentic is not a very popular word now, but self-perception I think is important. And as far as you're talking about post-truth, for instance, post-truth times, I think we need to really look at truth, as to what truth is all about. First of all, define what is truth. And in fact, poetry genuinely is doing that. It's in search for all the time truth of existence, truth of being, and that's why when I remember when I was, doing my PhD, and that's an ancient PhD now. The only reason I think about it is not because I was doing American fiction, because that was very popular at that time. And I was looking at, of all the people, Theodore Dreiser, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and all those writers. But look at what I was doing at that time. And today I want to go back to it in a more serious way. I was looking at the ideal of androgyny. And I often ask myself, why was I doing that at that time? And I know that I need to really explore it philosophically even more today. It's so relevant to be doing that. And this entire thing is actually, in one sense, going back to the not just Ardhanarishwar, what we talk about in our own mythological context, but also androgyny in the context of Greek classics. So what is it? I don't know, while I was thinking about it, I come across a novel, for instance, which I think is very poetic, and we don't even want to make a binary of poetry and, fiction in that fashion. So you see in that particular novel, it is called Ardhanarishwar, the novel, and there is a whole, it's in Hindi, and the whole discussion is on androgyny. It's also a discussion. It's a sociological discussion. It's a philosophical delving into it. And I find it a very progressive novel, which has been totally, Vishnu Prabhakar wrote it. It's totally, totally neglected. It was done about 25 years ago. And it's a big fat novel. And I remember I was again attracted to it, and I wrote a paper on it, which I presented in the Indian Institute of Advanced Study. So what I'm coming back to is this whole idea of how to just as the other thing is a constructed notion of binaries, how can we construct this reality, within the minds of not children as much as, and Somrita is very right when she says children are open to accepting a lot because they don't have preconceived notions. It is we, the adults, the teachers, who do it, and the family that does it to the child by virtue of everything what you refer to, colors and toys, the way they are bought and so on. So I remember how I tried very hard, and I think to partly as a mother I succeeded, but it's very difficult to see that your child doesn't get to play with whatever other people are giving the child, right? You are not buying that stuff for the child, but the other people, if it's a boy, is bound to get cars and aeroplanes and guns, of all the things, even guns are given, and the child goes around ta 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 all around. And what are we doing as a society, as a world society? It's not even just children, but in America even men are given guns in the hands all the time to do whatever they like, and that's why they're suffering the kind of violence that they do in the social context. So I think defining gender, which has been defined to a large extent by a lot of feminists and a lot of people like us who are also teaching gender, that's one part. But how do we disseminate that? Poetry is the best way to do it. And that is why I think of people like for instance, Adrienne Rich and the way she does it, the way you see Famida Riaz doing it in Pakistan. For years she did that. And the power of what is seen as the masculine to be found in a woman, the pointer that you see in the poetry of people like Famida Riaz and Kishwar Nahid and Kamla Das, for instance, the vibrancy of the word, how the word becomes powerful. It doesn't look effeminate, It's not that passivity that you see the masculinity in a positive way. If at all we want to put it in that way, masculine and feminine and so on. But this is another binary that's got created. Power, strength, though I think a woman is far more strong, than a man is, by virtue of the fact that she produces a child, right? And what she goes through and all of that, the body is far stronger, and the power of the mind is also there, if at all we want to compete with the other sex. But the point I'm making is that I think we have to do it through poetry more and more and more, and perhaps consciously prescribe that kind of poetry for our children to be brought up on it, and our adults to be exposed to it, because much of that kind of poetry, I know, for instance, I have tried very hard to put Kishwar Nahid in the center of the syllabus many times, and there are many people, for some reason or the other, they would push it aside. Oh, Famida, oh, but but she's a Pakistani, or something or the other, which is so inane and stupid in poetry to, fix a person with a nationality. But there is a resistance to it. The resistance is to defiance of any kind to what is established, which is detrimental to the health of uh, older people more than the children, and of course the children eventually who become adults. So it's a very gory situation we are in, and I know that for a trans person today in this society, what hell there is to try to negotiate in a profession or in a bureaucratic setup, because there's so much of prejudice. What are we trying to do? What the hell are we trying to do? Where is that social justice that is propounded all the time? So for social justice, for empathy, for healing, where there are deep wounds happening because of the way the prejudice functions, social prejudice functions. I think that's where poetry comes to our rescue. But we need to make it center stage and understand what poetry can do and what kind of poetry should come into the syllabus. Even for an engineering student, even for a medical student, for that matter. For the moment, that's it.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And I'm really sorry, Somrita ma'am, if I had interrupted you, because I think you were continuing with something, and I think there is a network disruption in my area. That's why I was not able to follow that. I'm really sorry. I beg your pardon. I'm so sorry for that. Now, coming to Deyasini ma'am, what do you think? Means, what is your perspective on gender, and what kind of poems have you read that made you feel that the society itself is gender?
Genia, so much have already been said by Somrita Di and Sukrita ma'am. I really don't want to be repeating myself again and bore you out. But yes, coming to the second part of your question, it was hard to think of the gendered society as a child, as that was a normalized construction that we were all conditioned to believe. But then now, when I reflect back, I find most of the poems that I grew up listening to speak uh, volumes about the societal structure and the societal misogyny of the times, they were produced in. And I came across a very interesting article by Shrija Mukhopadhyay and Purvi Tenvani, that talks about some of the very popular nursery rhymes that we all read as a child. Every one of us have done that. Like, Jack and Jill and Little Miss Muffet, and Miss Polly had a dolly. So, you see, that the female characters in all these rhymes are, and many more, and there are many, many more actually, they are not adequately represented. And they are not possessors, as Shrija says, of the so called manly prowess. And in these particular work, they are portrayed as very weak, servile, knave, conforming, and heavily dependent on men. So we do not know what happens to Jill after she comes tumbling, after she tumbles after. But then Jack's injury is dealt with such severity, and his struggles are highlighted. So uh, and then there is another interesting article, that I have come across, and this one is by Deepika Mukherjee. So, where she says that she can't recall a single poem in Bengali that ever made her feel brave and empowered as a girl. So, Genia, I believe so now times are different, and I believe books really constitute an important resource for children. Especially the pictures and illustrations have a large space in children's books. So now when they do not see themselves as being uh, adequately represented, now when they see themselves as invisible, I think it affects their self-esteem, and with no subversion or reversal of the gender roles, it is, it sometimes becomes difficult for the young minds to harbor heretical ideas with respect to gender roles. So, yeah, I would like to stop here.
Thank you so much. So, coming to the third question, regarding learning values and culture of India, how is poetry relevant in raising gender consciousness in contemporary, tech friendly children? I'll begin with Deyasini ma'am this time.
Okay. Thank you, Jenny, for the question. So, poetry, with its subtle shades of sociocultural hybridity, is a pertinent tool in raising gender consciousness, given the learning values in the culture of India. I think, it is important to uh, introduce children to poems, to books that celebrate different cultures and uh, that value people's differences regardless of their race, gender, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and disability. As Weisman aptly puts it, poetry incorporates the understanding that comes from being engaged in multiple contexts, cultures, and identities that actually enable children to uh, acquire perspective, uh, and become reflective readers who become able enough to challenge gender identifications and enlarge their self consciousness.
Okay. Now, coming to Shukrita ma'am. Ma'am, what is your take? Means, how do poetry inculcate the learning values and create a reverence for the culture of India in current, or rather in contemporary tech friendly children?
Yeah, I think one of the major things that um, it's been happening always, but I think we need to highlight it more, which is how does one reinterpret and redefine mythology, right? How does one take on Draupadi? How does one re-perceive Sita, right? How does one look at Mandodari, Urmila? And there have been poets in Hindi I know of, Dinkar, for instance, and many others, Yashwant Prasad, who have really re-looked at mythology in a not just female icons of mythological icons, but also concepts. Concepts have been taken up in poetry, and how does that slowly get decoded and then encoded afresh? How is, for instance, Draupadi not just seen as an object? In fact, even in the iconic television serial of Mahabharata, the speech that Rahi Masoom Raza put into the mouth of Draupadi is very empowering. You know, if you very carefully listen to it, it's very empowering. And we have been told by people like, some very eminent, Romila Thapar has told us very clearly that if you look at the ancient perception of, I'm talking about, say, for instance, Valmiki's Sita, is more empowered than what comes later. You know, a certain kind of, in our anglicized mind, is Victorianism, conservatism, etc., that comes up later, right? And then we impose patriarchal notions on how to represent Sita, and therefore, by the time we come to Tulsidas, it's a different Sita that you have altogether. Or for that matter, Shakuntala. How is Shakuntala represented? So I think it's very important to look at how, mythology plays a very, we have a living mythology in our country. It's not like the West, who have to consult encyclopedias to work out what their mythology, Greek and Roman, etc., is. In our context, we don't have to be even literate to know who is Sita and who is Draupadi and so on. So it's so easy, if we were to build into our poetry, which is already happening, but to also see, the good from the bad, and work out what is relevant for our social context, in our particular cultural context, and how do we want to re-look at it all. Because we know that there are many, many people who go on with the conservative norms that are, set up, and what has been normalized forever. We need to really unlearn all that. And to unlearn all that, like, very often required, even if that has to become sloganous, it doesn't matter, even if it is sloganous, because I think a certain kind of autonomy of being, essential being, has to be realized by a woman herself. And how even man woman, even the so-called heterosexual, kind of relationship or whatever, would be peaceful only, or harmonious only, when there is respect for each other. The moment the relationship becomes oppressive, then there is bound to be problems, series of problems, I say. So I think this whole idea of what is freedom, what is autonomy, what is gender, what are the values to be cherished, how do you respect difference, for that matter, I think this is all embedded in our cultural material, but we need to either re-look at it, or we need to redefine some of that in our poetry. And I think if we are theoretically conscious, very deeply convinced about what we want to do, it will happen. It does happen. But the only thing is that gets under the carpet very fast, because for the majority, it's not. It's not. I mean, we know how patriarchy functions. It is so convenient to let it be, and not disturb the order the way it is. So everybody's scared of that. Let the family norm be, however inequality there might be, however much the oppression is on the mother or the grandmother or the girl child. It just carries on the way it is, because you don't want to disturb the apple cart, you know. So it just goes on and on like that. So I think some interventions are required, and more effective. Literature is activism. I always say that. Literature is activism, because it goes so. That's why we use terms like, oh, I'm touched, I'm moved, and so on. Okay, if you are touched, something has happened. Some transformation has happened within you. But be with it for a little while. Normally, we just want to get over with it. Okay, I'm crying over something, but just get over it. Okay, okay, everything is fine. And the same order continues. I think we have to disturb the apple cart of patriarchy first and foremost. Okay?
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now coming to Somrita, ma'am, how would you uh, think? Means, what do you think? How is poetry relevant in today's world, dealing with contemporary children, as to how to instill the learning values and how to make or rejuvenate the rich culture of India?
Genia, I have a one line answer to this because that is what works for me. That is what propels me to write. Poetry is not propaganda. And that is why it has survived the test of time, and that is why it will continue to survive. And that is why it will continue to change worlds. How many political pamphlets have the power to change society? But poetry has, down the ages, starting from the epics to to the times that you're talking about, this very sort of tech friendly spoken word poetry generation that we are living in. um, Poetry will change things because it doesn't come with the agenda of trying to change anyone. The only agenda that poetry or poets seek um, is the commitment to truth, my individual truth and the collective truth of the times and the space, the spatial and temporal reality that I'm rooted in. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. I've just been like sounding very hoarse today, but thank you for bearing with me. So, to go back to your question, you were talking about Indian culture. First of all, I just want to problematize that a little bit. Because, when I say that my poetry needs to necessarily promote Indian culture, I'm saying everything is right with Indian culture. I don't think any culture can assume such a status for itself. So, for every generation, for every poet, the onus is on this poet, this writer, to see what part of that culture is working, what part is not working, and then to bring in both aspects in their poetry. Because my commitment is to the truth, my commitment is not to my culture. Because if that is what I would have been, as Shukrita very interestingly pointed out, the Sita of Valmiki's times, for instance, was probably far more empowered than the Sita of the Middle Ages. And now we have more stories of Sita coming up. Same with Draupadi. The Draupadi that might have been initially sort of, all of this is with an asterisk because we don't know who the original quote unquote Sita was, who the original Draupadi was. But to me too, it seems, if you study the culture of that times, because this is a culture that produced the Kama Sutra, this is a culture that produced the Kama Shastras, this is a culture that worshipped a naked goddess, that worshipped a goddess that stands on her husband, that worships the Shakti of Kali. So I do believe that this culture was probably a little more empowered than the Victorian culture that has been handed down to us, the Victorianized Indian culture that has been handed down to us. So, going back to that, as Shukriti pointed out, so if I'm trying to talk about an Indian culture, I have to study the Indian culture in all its forms and then represent that through my writing, whether that's, again, not to go into that binary of, verse and prose, through my writings, let's say, right? So, which is why I think writings have this explosive potential to change the world. Because they are seeking the truth, trying to sieve the truth out of, the rest of the husk, and also because writing uh, empowers you with imagination. That which does not exist can exist through your writing. You cannot think of sunny domes and caves of ice in physics, but a Coleridge can think of it in Kubla Khan. So, writing has the power to imagine and envision a society that is free of these constraints which we have, tied ourselves up with. And eventually, I think writing works or poetry works because a part of it is also very, um, it stems from empathy. It stems from this idea of healing, this idea of trying to heal, this idea of therapy. So it's gentle, it's not aggressive, it's not, coming at you with a message which is overwhelming. I need you to break down gender. No, you could just read a poem, and this works better with languages, I feel, that are not gendered. For example, I read this poem in Bangla, and if you did not know who the poet was, you wouldn't know the gendered identity of the poem because the pronoun used was she. Wo works in Hindi as well. Even though in Hindi there are certain markers, the sentence will tell you if wo is a thrilling or pulling. In Bangla, that doesn't happen. So the poem was about she, wo, that person. You don't know the gendered identity of that person, and if you do not know who the poet is, you're really free to imagine a space for yourself. So poetry doesn't come at you with an agenda, with a propaganda, with a manifesto. Even though I'm very happy to read certain manifestos, they are very important for us, theoretically speaking. I think poetry will survive the test of time because of how it's able to massage in um, change instead of hammering it at you.
That was a really good answer. Thank you so much. Now, coming to Shukrita ma'am. Ma'am, this is a question particularly addressed to you. You were born and brought up in Kenya. Later on, you moved back to your homeland. What was the common thread that binds together the experience of women both in Kenya and India? And
Yeah.
how does this? Sorry. Yes, ma'am.
No, no. No, well, I just want to mention this that, yes, I was in Kenya and I was born there. So, I mean, it's not really coming back to India, but it's like coming for the first time kind of situation when I was born and brought up in Kenya and I came to India. But I do want to mention that in Kenya also there was a little India, right? And in that little India, there was a little more consciousness, which is always there with diaspora in general, to how to retain the culture, right? And therefore, what Somrita said, I think, is very right, and we should keep that in mind. And I used to react to a lot of conservatism in that India, in Kenya, right? Because the desire was to, somehow conserve that Indianness. And how do you do it? Through your mythology, which is mythology, culture, practices, behavior, beliefs, etc., which probably in India people had moved on a little, but there was a kind of a frozen culture. Like if even today you find, in many parts of the world, these Indians or whichever uh, people who go out, they like to carry that cultural frozen and then freeze it there. They carry their culture and freeze it there, and there's no progress. So on the one hand, it was that, but on the other hand, I was blessed by the fact that I had parents who were in education and they were enlightened parents, truly educated. My father was a writer, a very important writer. So he was not a typical, kind of an Indian who was settled there. He was relating with the Africans in a very significant way. And my mother was teaching in a school which was British for a long period. So I had the good fortune of being in a truly multicultural situation. And I could, on the one hand, have the exposure to conservatism and the reaction to conservatism within the house, all that was happening. And I would therefore say that by the time I came to India, I was fully equipped to defy, whatever I saw. I was equipped and I needed the language that was needed by me. And I was already 15 by the time I came, and that's a reasonably good age, right? So I was beginning to write my poetry and all of that. And I found that the defiance in poetry, and that I was taught by my father in one sense, the aesthetics, the defiance, as Somrita, what you said, it doesn't have to be like, you're kind of out loud and you're kind of throwing it at other people. No. How do you, in a way that define, every poem is in that sense defiance, no matter what you say in a poem, because it's shaking what is the established so-called established truth. There is one small dimension which you open up to another reality, right? But you do it in a, yes, there is defiance, but if it's not the defiance which merits reaction, it merits action, further action, right? So so that is what I think I gathered through the multicultural, kind of scenario in which I was brought up. And the value of poetry and aesthetics was instilled in me by and by, which is not normal in an Indian household. But as I said, my mother was a teacher of literature and my father was a writer himself. So that helped hone that kind of a sensibility. But there was another thing which I think helped me in a big way. Africans at that time were fighting for their freedom, right? Kenya was seeking freedom. And it was for the first time, I mean, in the last 2, 3 years that I was there, when I was 13, 14, 15, what I saw was men and women fighting for freedom much later than they got their freedom, political freedom, much later than we had. So we got ours. So as a result, I think I saw a certain kind of, I would say, the very primitive vitality, vibrancy, elemental vibrancy that I saw with African men and women, coming together on the roads and, seeking freedom from the British at that time. And more than the British, it was also seeking freedom from the anglicized Asians out there, because that is what was being practiced. Racism of a, double racism that was happening there. So I think while there were some continuities, but there were a lot of confrontational kind of politics that I saw from this side and from that side. And therefore, I feel blessed that I found in all that thought which could mean that you could demolish and reconstruct, and that's my favorite terminology, as you can make out, but also to find new language. I was not scared of finding new language. I wasn't hesitant about it at all. That is why I veered towards the poets of the kind that I've been mentioning, because they were, and not just that, even in Urdu. My father was a writer in Urdu, so I was exposed to Ismat Chugtai, who actually created a female, feminine language. Not feminine is the wrong word, female language of women, Begumati Zuban. That Begumati Zuban came from Ismat in Urdu literature, Ismat Chugtai. And so I was brought up on that, and even if I wasn't reading Urdu at all at that time, but that was being talked about in the house, and the value of the language that was created for women by Ismat. And how did she do it? Just, and I would stop after that. And I did a whole book on that, Ispat, Her Life, Her Times. And as I grew up, I did that book. Why did I do it after having done American literature and all that? Because I wanted to identify myself even as an academic with that reality in in the English department. To work on an author in my times, which was like Urdu author, was not easy, because they weren't giving me space for that, no leave for that. But however, I did it only because I saw the value of how language needed to be, a new language of women needed to be created. And like somebody said, I think it was Elaine Showalter who talked about gynae, what did she use? Gynae critics, How did they create and perceive that language, women's language, which Sylvia Plath did in America to a large extent and became an icon. Ismat Chugtai was doing it. And I worked on an author like Krishna Sopti, who was doing it in Hindi, creating her own language for women. So I think that also is a domain that needs to be explored. How there is so much of unsaid material experientially by women. It's unsaid because there is no language for it that exists. So we have to identify those authors and poets who have created language for us, and we can take it forward. Always take it forward. And that is why I think I owe a lot to Mahadevi Akka. you know, and Lalde, all these people who were in medieval times and even earlier writing and thinking and singing songs, which were that of in a different language, and outside of marriage, they were doing whatever they wanted to. Hmm.
Yes, ma'am.
You know,
And
just wanted to comment sorry, Gennia. I just wanted to
yeah,
comment
sure.
on something that Sukriti said. You know, about not even being able to identify this lacuna, that there is this vacuum, and
Hmm.
obviously vacuums don't exist. So something exists which we are not being able to identify. You know, there's
Hmm.
a paper in our university which is on post-colonial literatures. And there are six writers that we study in this paper. Only one is a woman, Mamang Dai.
Oh,
And you know, you sit and you wonder what went wrong with the people that were setting the syllabus.
yes.
I mean, you don't even have to think of contemporaries if you are shy, if you want to give a certain flavor. There were so many. I mean, Sukrita just sat here and mentioned so many names. So, you know, just to sort of go back there, that, you know, of course there's poetry, but this is also a political act, that you need to have more people on these boards of studies that will
Yes.
sanction leaves, as
Yeah.
Shukrita said, if you want to work on Lalde, that
Hmm.
will include uh, Mamang Dai and a Toni Morrison and more contemporary female voices. It doesn't have to be just from India,
Yes.
right? So, you know, this is also political. Sorry, we completely
No,
went
not
off.
right.
Go
Right. Yeah.
ahead.
Mm-hmm. And
It's
sometimes
absolutely
that.
fine. Yes. Now, coming to Somrita ma'am only, I was about to ask you this, that you have published multiple poems of your own and you are adept in translation. How has your perception of gender equality transformed over the years, and how difficult is it to portray gender equality through poetry to children? And I would request you to read out from your poetry for your audience if you have.
Give me just a second. I do have something, but I think I'll change and I'll read something else which I feel might work for the discussion that we've been having. Yeah, here it is. Uh, this one's called Eating a Mango in Calcutta. The Irish nun in finishing school taught me how to eat a mango in summer. Knife, fork, tip of my forefinger, thumb. But some women come from a different soil. They eat with hands, mouths, eyes. My mother, my mother's mother, my mother's mother's mother. Women wild, fertile, women who dared to laugh, bleed, wear red. It is not eating, they said, until you've plucked the fruit, spat out seeds, spilled the juice, sucked it dry. Can't eat ripe mangoes on hot afternoons in Calcutta without sweating. For eating is a verb, a metaphor that can birth love.
Beautiful.
So,
Mm.
thank you. Um, I suppose that's how you talk
That
about
was
gender,
lovely.
through poetry, right? Because what is poetry? It's a code, and you leave it on the reader to decode it. You've encoded a message through your metaphor. And you do not use metaphors lightly. You do not play around with them because they can birth meanings, and these meanings have a lot of potential. So this one was actually this is from a forthcoming anthology. It's called Mrs. Dalloway in Calcutta. So, who is Mrs. Dalloway, right? 1925. Again, not poetry, but through art, because Virginia Woolf grew up on a culture of flaneurs, men, gentlemen strollers that walked the cities. And in 1925, she says, no, I'm going to walk the streets of London. So Mrs. Dalloway says, I will buy the flowers myself. And she goes out. And it's interesting, we don't have a word for a female flaneur. Flaneuse, flannery, there are all sorts of ridiculous coinages. Um, See, this is an anthology about women that want to walk, women that dared to walk. Because, I grew up in a culture that told me that women don't walk the streets. And the ones that do are not the ones that you want to become, because who are they? They are the whores or they are the homeless. Alliterative effect aside, you don't want to become these women. And if you also think about everything that is constructed around us, look at the shoes that are made for us, look at the kind of clothing that are made for us. These are not made for walking. These are not made for us to go and occupy the streets and public spaces, right? I want to, trapeze and trampoline down a street. I don't want to feel like a trespasser with every pair of eyes staring at me. So I've tried to explore that through this work. I believe that's how I try to talk about gender. I talk about bodies, I talk about my experiences, and I think there is something to be said about each of us um, fighting for our truths and writing our own truths. There'll be a million people that'll try to tell you what to believe, but will say it nobody else. They could say it, they will probably not say it the way I can. And so that's how I try to talk about gender through my works. My gendered consciousness, to go back to your question, has been framed in my family, my mother, my grandmother. I'm a third generation learner, so I'm indebted to the person, my system that they instilled in me, and from my father. My father is a feminist. I learned feminism from my father even before I learned it from my mother, because of the things that he would do. Um, my, he would tell my mom, "Why don't you sleep for a couple of more hours? I'll bathe Urni and I'll take care of her." He would polish my shoes, he would iron my shirt, because he knew that mom was up with me all night long. I was a difficult child, and she would have to go to work, just as he would have to go to work. 8 o'clock, both of them would have to leave. So, yeah, I learned to be a feminist from my father. There is something to be said about teaching the male children in the family as well. You can empower women, but this empowerment is going to be lopsided if the other part of the society is not willing to embrace this change, this power, this Shakti.
That was so good. That was lovely bit of poetry. And I wish you all success in your recent publication. Good luck to you. Now, coming to Deyasini ma'am. Ma'am, you too also means you too have published poems in various anthologies and online platforms. What inclined you towards poetry and how do you convey your message of gender equality through it? And if you can read a few poems or a poem that can do that, please do so.
Thank you, Genia. I think I had the sensibility in me before I could realize it, I come from a family with a very refined taste in the arts. And I wrote my very first poem at the age of 2. No, sorry, it would be wrong to say I wrote, since I started writing in Bangla much later. So that was, a string of poetry followed thereafter, and they were mostly written down and preserved by my brother in Mocha Brown Diary. So, uh, yeah, and as part as the second part of your question concerns, I feel words are a powerful medium. They can be both oppressive and liberating. And Genia, when I write with a lot of hope in my heart. And whenever I write something new, I get to encounter a much bigger self. Let me tell you. So here's the poem that I wanted to read for you all. So it's called As a Child. Here I go. As a child, I was the seedling of the Krishnachura tree. When every summer morn I would open the floodgates of my orange red emotions to climb onto the cracked spine of my mother's broken walls, shining in the burning filigrees of my laughter, sometimes hiding in the folds of his sari that smelled of shapla flowers, growing along the edge of the pond where Baba and I would dive to retrieve the remnants of our lost summer days. When outside, I became tall, taller than my mother, deeper than her folds, wider than the blue of her sari. I grew with all who came to play with me. When I close my eyes and hear their voices still gurgling down the rivers of my body when I speak to you, Ma would seize me back home and lock my body at every dusk. My stem would swell up, my belly protrude like the pink cotton balls of childhood. The wheels of the candy would not roll on my tongue any more, nor would I see Kaku with his empire of ice creams. You were still too little, Ma would say, when I asked for one. I have shed my leaves this winter for the children to play upon my fallen beatings with their tiny feet, to bring me my mother's music. Aren't you my big girl? I am, Ma. And so I would silently fall in the violets of the moss-grown bench, turn myself to the time when Ma sang to me, fed me spoons of doodh bhat, and I swallowed the ever-juicy grapes of her soul. And some days I would not, and keep it inside the pleated royal blue skirt of my tongue. Years later, I walked by the same spot wearing my blue skirt to find the park no more, and would smell the white jasmine tresses of my origami tree. Did Ma hide it inside its dark folded breast for me to play when the long pleats of my skirt would shorten, fade, and fly no more? The only tree that had folds deeper like the veins on my mother's palm, that would run into mine and forever grow and melt in me as I grow. The bench would go missing, and I would sit on the rough-hewn slab of the newly constructed complex. When the rains would hit my face thus, I would shout, "My seeds are still alive. Now they have taken the shape of my half-eaten candies of childhood, sparkling in the yellow fermented milk of dusk, circling round me like the medley of my mother's gold bangles." Thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now coming to the last question of the session, I'll start with Sukrita ma'am. Ma'am, if you were a Santa, what would be your advice to children and parents?
I would say that they should have bags full of poems. coming to them.
Yeah, true.
You know, they could play with them, they could bother them if they like, they could break them and redo them like jigsaw puzzles, but a bag full. Yeah.
Uh, Coming to Somrita ma'am, what would be your advice to children and the parents?
Genia, this is actually something that I was discussing with Coral. So she turned it into a poster and she's been sharing it on the TMYS page. So even at the risk of repeating myself, I will, because this is something that I really, really deeply believe in. I would love for parents to instill in their children the value of friendship. And I would love for children to grow up with the idea that romance is not the only relationship that you ought to chase in life. That your friends who've seen you without your masks, who've seen you with your walls down, who've seen you at your best and your worst, will become family someday if you keep them close. So if I were Santa and if I were talking to my younger self, or other children who might care to listen to this very hoarse Santa today, it would be to it would be to not feel pressurized by society, uh, and chase relationships that are meaningful to them and not relationships that are imposed on them.
Thank you so much. And coming to Deyasini ma'am, what would be your advice if you were a
Uh,
Santa?
so, so Genia, if I were a Santa, I would tell children that, you know, all the differences that coexist are as beautiful as a river meeting a sea, just like the different fingers of your mother's hand that come together to cook for you your favorite meal. So children are like sponge. Their impressionable minds absorb everything, and parents must nurture them, shape them tenderly, teach them to celebrate themselves for who they are, for who their friends are, and everybody around them, and open their door to understanding the true essence of inclusivity, love, and companionship. I would like to stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am. And before we go to the end of the session, Shukrita ma'am, I request you, can you please grace the ending of the poem with one of your poetry?
Okay. I will read a very simple one. In fact, I've been talking about how mythology needs to be looked at all over again. Maybe I should read a poem which fits in with that idea, right? So, this is a poem that I did some time ago as part of a book called Country Drive. And this is a poem called Draupadi on a Hunt. I am on the lookout. Is this where I might find what I'm looking for? Yes, this way, not that way. Draupadi stormed out of Mahabharat, became a squirrel, and climbed up the tree as did Manto's Toba Tek Singh. Look down, is this Hindustan or Pakistan? Barbed wire between the two lovers, real as their love. On all fours do I crawl, holding on to the earth's call, not to fly, nor abandon them, not to forget the one and only, nor the rest of them, rumbling and whispering, with all the tales and myths gurgling in the earth's belly. I am on the lookout. Thank you. Thank you.
That was so good. So,
Thank you.
thank you for the session and thank you for your time this evening. This was actually a very good and enriching session, and the exchange of ideas, opinions, and poetry are enough to sensitize an individual to become a sensible and empathetical person. And discussions such as these are actually necessary for the exchange of ideas and the betterment of the future generation. I therefore end it on a good note, and let me tell the viewers, tell me your story calls for submission on the story prompt Letters from Santa. Registrations are also open for the writing program season 9. We hope to hear from you. Till then, stay well, stay happy, stay together.